Hello everyone, it's Wednesday, it's 1 o'clock, and this is Student Affairs Live. I am your host, Heather Shea Gasser, broadcasting live today from my professional home here at Michigan State University. And I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Kathy Collins, Dr. Rachel Beach, and Robert Coffey to the show to discuss the topic of serving international students on campus today. Before we get started with the show, I have a couple of announcements. Student Affairs Live, as many of you know, is a part of the Higher Ed Live network. And Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a marketing and communications firm that works with education institutions on branding, strategy, web design, and more. In August, M. Stoner is going to be hosting a complimentary webinar focused on using experience maps, an invaluable tool in visitor-centered web design, in your projects to ensure a positive user experience. So we're tweeting out a link where you can learn more and register for this exciting webcast opportunity. If you've never watched our show before, one thing you should know is that Higher Ed Live produces a series of professional development web shows and podcasts, which are always free and accessible to you in our archives on higheredlive.com, as well as on iTunes. And you can be a part of our broadcast today by tuning in live and sharing your insights and questions using the Higher Ed Live hashtag on Twitter. And I'll be reminding you of all that at some point during the show today. If you'd like to receive weekly updates about our live show dates and times, you can subscribe to the Higher Ed Live newsletter. And we are also currently conducting a user survey, so we would appreciate your feedback about that. Tell us a little bit about how we can make your user experience with Higher Ed Live more productive and more useful. And if you complete that survey, we will enter you into a drawing for a $100 Amazon gift card. Quite the deal. So today's show would not be possible without the support of my home institution, Michigan State University, and our producer, M. Stoner. So on with the show. So as many of you know who are watching today, across the United States this fall, institutions of higher education are enrolling the largest ever incoming cohort of international students. This number has grown steadily over the past 7 years, and according to the 2013 Open Doors report by the Institute of International Education, which we'll post a link to on our website, the largest percentage of international students come from China, South Korea, and India. As we all know in student affairs, how effectively we serve, connect, and engage these students this fall may determine how effectively we're able to recruit and retain students in the future. So today's show stemmed from a very real trend that we're seeing here at Michigan State University. So consequently, I invited two of my guests who work here at MSU with me, Dr. Kathy Collins and Bob Coffey. So welcome to Kathy and Bob. And I've also invited another expert and the Director of International Admissions from the University of Arizona, Dr. Rachel Beach, to talk about another university's perspectives. So thank you to all three of my guests today, Kathy, Bob, and Rachel. And also thanks to everybody who's watching Student Affairs Live or taking time out of your busy schedule and joining us today. If you have a question for today's panelists, please send us a tweet at Higher Ed Live. So we did actually crowdsource several of today's show questions, so thank you to all of you who contributed. We're going to try to cover as many of them as possible. We used my networks via Twitter and Facebook, and if you'd like to contribute to future shows, you can follow me on Twitter and at Heather Gasser, and look for future announcements about crowdsourced questions. So to begin with, I'd like each of you to please give us a brief description of your experience in student affairs and specifically talk about how you've worked with international students. So Kathy, would you mind starting for us today?
Certainly. First, thank you for participating today. I know for many of us on our college campuses, this is a busy time of year, so happy August to everyone out there and all of my colleagues around the country. So I have been working in student affairs now for over 25 years at multiple institutions around the country, ranging in size from 1,200 to over 49,000. I have served in housing, in conduct, in orientation. I have done some work in assessment with the Student Leader Learning Outcomes Project out of Texas A&M University, and have also had the great opportunity to work abroad and did that at King Abdullah University of Science and Technology in 2009 in Saudi Arabia, where I served as a consultant there in their primary year. King Abdullah is the first coeducational institution in Saudi Arabia, and served as a consultant there during their opening year. And certainly over the last several years have worked with a growing number of international students, like many of you, on our college campuses. So as we work with not only our growing number of international students and hopefully their successful transition, persistence, and completion of their degrees at our college campuses, we also want to work with our domestic students who are not only hopefully are looking at opportunities to study abroad, but also are looking at opportunities and how do we have a college campus that is a global community with all of our students coming together. So that's a little bit about my opportunities in working with international students, and certainly with our students looking to go abroad.
Great. Thanks so much, Kathy, for being here today. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Bob.
I'm so glad to be on the call today. I'm currently a doctoral candidate in the Higher Adult and Lifelong Education program here at Michigan State. Prior to MSU, I worked for about 13 years in higher education and student services at a variety of different institutions across different functional areas. So I worked in conflict resolution, residential life and housing, and LGBT support services. I have worked alongside international students, faculty, and staff in every role, as I imagine all of you have as well. And I've long had an interest in international education. Since coming to MSU, I had the chance to travel to China with the College of Education here, and that experience really got me interested in the global flow of students and how institutions in the US and in Canada recruit and retain to graduation international students, and how their presence impacts on our campuses here. So that became my dissertation topic. I'm looking at the experiences of international students that use education agents through the recruitment process. And alongside my dissertation work, I've also taken on some leadership within ACPA. I'm currently the chair for ACPA's Commission for the Global Dimensions of Student Development. And within ACPA, we're a hub for people with an interest in international education.
Great. Bob, thanks so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. Rachel, tell us a little bit about your experience in student affairs.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I have been in student affairs for about 12 years now. My experience has been kind of all over the transition map in terms of coming into universities. I've worked with students in academic advising roles, engagement programs within academic colleges, orientation, and first-year success kind of stuff, and then about 2 years ago came into this role as Director of International Admissions here at the University of Arizona. And this has been a change for me. It's been a lot of learning about focusing on how international students transition into US-based institutions. And my shop does all of the undergraduate admissions processes for degree-seeking and non-degree seeking students who are coming from abroad, but also for transcript evaluation for students who have studied abroad. So we work with domestic students who have gone abroad, and for U.S. citizens who have international credentials, which is another part of this market share. So a little bit all over the place, but definitely a growing focus and interest in international and making sure that their transitions to institutions are smooth.
Fantastic. As you can see, we have a fabulous panel today, and I really appreciate you all being here. Bob, I want to start with you. You mentioned being involved with the ACPA Commission on Global Dimensions of Student Development. Can you give us a brief history lesson about how U.S. higher ed has traditionally served international students and how current trends are changing these practices?
Well, you know, doctoral candidates are not typically known to be brief, but I will certainly do my best to keep my comments concise. In terms of a history lesson, I think it's certainly worth pointing out that U.S. colleges and universities have been hosting international students and faculty almost since their inception. So in a lot of ways, this is not a new trend, but I do think that there have been significant developments in the history of U.S. engagement through the participation of international students. I think if we look back to the post-war period, U.S. colleges and universities hosted a pretty modest number of international students, and oftentimes the hope was that these students would then return to their home countries and play some leadership, exercise some political or economic or cultural leadership in their home countries that would make them good allies and friends of the U.S. They would have had an experience of life here, and in that way, I think the U.S. hoped that it could exercise some soft power through the presence of alumni back in their home countries. And as you see, I think the legacy of that focus are in our immigration policies that actually set quite a number of hurdles to international students who want to stay living and working in the U.S. after graduation. There are many other destination countries that actually facilitate international students staying and gaining permanent residency, and I think in that way the U.S. is a bit of an outlier. I would say two things have changed pretty markedly in the past 10 to 20 years, if not going back earlier than that. One is the emergence of middle classes in a lot of the top sending countries like China and India. There are now far more students with the resources able to consider going abroad. And oftentimes, the emergence of this middle class has been accompanied by efforts to grow the post-secondary system in these countries. But in many cases, that system can't grow fast enough to keep up with demand. And so, particularly for students that are shut out of top institutions in their home country, oftentimes that prompts people to look abroad as a plan B. And so, that in part explains the wave of students from some of these top countries coming to institutions that in some cases don't actually have a history of hosting very many international students. I think the other trend on the North American side is that with declining public support for post-secondary education, it's really prompted a search for additional revenue streams in cases where the admissions market is already mature, that the markets that you're typically tapping into, there's a need to identify additional catchment areas to recruit from. And so that's really stimulated a lot of interest, again, from institutions that may not have a history of recruiting abroad, looking to bring international students in and to increase their numbers here.
Fabulous. That was great. Just as a follow-up, I know one of the things that we've talked a lot about is just terminology, and maybe you can just also mention a little bit about the difference between internationalization and globalization, because we hear those two terms tossed around quite a lot.
Well, I would say, especially in scholarly circles, it's a contested topic. There are some people who use the terms interchangeably, and even in the scholarly literature, you'll see the terms used interchangeably. There have been other folks who have said that there is a distinction, that globalization, I once had someone explain to me that it's like finding a Coke machine at every airport in the world, sort of like the way in which a country extends its cultural or political or economic hegemony broadly through the world. And if you wonder about how it might be to be in the country that's on the receiving end of that, you can imagine some of the tension that some people associate with the word globalization. Some people use the term internationalization to describe a kind of partnership that's more equitable, that implies that there's mutual benefit for both sides, that there's mutual authorship on both sides. You will find writers and scholars and commentators that say that that's a fig leaf, and that the power asymmetry that often accompanies these kinds of partnerships, so for example, between the U.S. and a country, and a developing country, let's say, that power asymmetry is baked into that partnership, and it's hard to get to a true egalitarian place with those partnerships. But I think that, so hopefully I've muddied the waters, and I suppose a takeaway, certainly for me as someone that is studying international education, I've learned to be really precise in what word I use and to provide a definition in terms, so that folks that are reading or hearing me know what I'm talking about when I use the term.
Fantastic. That was helpful. So starting, I think we talked and framed this show about welcoming students to campus. So we're really starting with that search process and admissions process. And Rachel, since you work directly in international admissions, what are some of the best practices that the U of A has adopted to outreach, recruit, and admit international students, or have you seen on other campuses as well?
Sure. So I think this is an interesting topic area, because it's something that many institutions, and I think where U of A was maybe 3-4 years ago, was trying to fit the model that we use for domestic student recruitment in the global space. And it works in some ways. There's absolutely places where the international market and the domestic market are highly similar. Those are places where I would consider there to be context for U.S. higher education. These are places where maybe they get a lot of U.S. television, especially at the children's television level, so they're watching images of what American high school or American college looks like. Whether or not those are accurate representations is probably a whole different topic, but at least they have some context. They maybe are even getting things like NCAA sports broadcast in their country, so they have some pieces. Those individuals, we do tend to recruit a little bit more like we would a domestic. For our case, for those of you who maybe don't know about the University of Arizona, our mascot are the Wildcats, but our catchphrase is bear down. And that has to do with a story and a whole history here at the institution. But putting both Wildcats and bear down in the same document going to an international student can be very, very confusing because, one, they may not have context for why we're calling them a Wildcat. Two, Wildcats don't have anything to do with bears, so why are they interchangeable? So for us, it's really been adapting what we do so that our message is consistent, so that you know who we are as an institution, but we're doing it in a way that is friendly to international students. And one of the things we do really proactively is what I call flattening the language. We in the United States, and I think actually anywhere in the English-speaking world, use a lot of local colloquialism to describe what we're talking about in that context. And so for us, it's really important that if we are using a word, we're using the word with the definition that is most direct. So we don't do a lot of things like putting seeing or hearing. We're going to say in the document, right? We don't see something about the U of A, or we don't hear something about the U of A, or you're not going to hear this on campus. You're going to experience, because that's really what we're talking about. And so really kind of the best practices in working on the admission side is making sure that your message is clear and consistent, and that the promises you're fulfilling or the promises you're making can be fulfilled. And that has a lot to do with partnering with our the rest of our campus partners. I think as all admissions offices do, and in all topic areas, if we're the sales arm of the institution in some ways, we need to make sure that what we're selling is an accurate product. And so it goes a lot to fit, but it also goes a lot to explaining where we are in the country. Arizona and Arkansas and Alaska and Alabama all sound exactly the same if you don't know U.S. geography. I mean, we always talk about that we have sunshine-filled days and that our winter temperatures are 18 to 24 degrees Celsius. We don't talk about the 40-plus Celsius in the summer, but we do talk about the weather and we talk about the context of the environment. The number of times we're even in places like Canada or the UK, places you would think maybe have more U.S. geographic knowledge, I'm getting questions of, so you're about an hour and a half from Memphis, right? Tucson and Memphis are not quite that close. You know, so we do put things in. You put maps. You say we're close to California, we're close to Las Vegas, and making sure students know where we are. So a lot of the best practices is really about connecting students not only to the institution and the majors and the academic opportunities, but also connecting them to understanding the context of American higher education and then the context of our location in the country.
That's great. That's great. Rachel, I think you kind of talked a little bit about how we ensure institutional fit. Kathy or Bob, do you have any thoughts on institutional fit and how to help international students make those choices?
I think that it's an interesting question on so many levels, because like so many of our domestic students, people are coming to have that successful opportunity that leads to the completion of a degree. And how are we helping students in that selection, not only of the opportunity to come to a college, same as our domestic students, but in the opportunity that they're going to be successful and obtain that degree? And what does that degree mean? You know, so one of the things that I know at Michigan State University so many people are doing now is we've put so much weight on internships. We've put so much weight on so many of these other opportunities, whether it be a practicum or an internship, depending on your field. But for our international students, that may not mean anything. There may not be an equivalency to that in their home country. And have we created, I love Rachel's concept of, have we flattened that out and looked for what might be the equivalent in their home country of that? And are we creating those opportunities for that translation, for that student to be successful when they go back to their home country with the experience that they've had while at our institution here in the United States? And I think that's the story we need to tell. And one of the things that I've seen a lot of institutions start to do is not only recruit abroad, but also start to send their career services teams abroad.
Mm-hmm.
And how are they doing that, and where are they doing that? So maybe there is something that's equivalent to an internship for an engineering major, which is so important in their field here in the United States. But what does that look like if a student is going back to China? What does that look like if a student's going back to India? So I think it's finding those opportunities and exploring what is the translation of the opportunity. We translate language all the time. What is the translation of the opportunity? Because it's about the successful completion of the degree for all of our students, and we know that. So, Bob, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I do. I think, when we think about the networks that domestic students use when they are engaged in the college search, and you might have, your parents may have gone somewhere, or a relative may have gone to a particular institution, and your teachers and other adults in your life that you've got to, for many students that are coming out of backgrounds where they've got these rich networks that they can leverage when they're assessing what options are available. And, with thousands of institutions here, the quest to find one that is a fit often starts with, what are the experiences of people in these networks, and how can I draw on that to kind of make my own decisions. For international students, those networks are far sparser when you think about it. They've certainly may have heard of the hyper-elite institutions, but just by sheer numbers, the clear majority of international students that are coming to the U.S. today are not going to be attending those institutions. They need to find a fit that aligns with their talents. And so, and as Rachel has pointed out, the nomenclature is different. In this country, college and university are pretty interchangeable, but that's not true when you go elsewhere. And so I think in terms of how we help international students find a good fit, part of it is by not assuming that they know what we know about higher education in this country, and helping to, and providing information, the kind of information that's helpful, and find a way of delivering that information that's helpful for students.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
So, Kathy, I know you come previous to Michigan State from Texas A&M, and obviously Michigan State has a huge institutional culture. Talk to me a little bit about how an increase in international students impacts the campus as a whole, at the macro level, at the institutional culture level. And then what about some of the micro level, as the director of housing on campus, what happens at the roommate level as well?
Sure. Heather, that's a great question, because I think for people who don't know, Michigan State's experienced such a rapid increase in the number of international students over the last several years, where only 4 or 5 years ago, having several hundred international students on our campus, to this year alone in housing, we'll have over 2,100 students in housing who are international students of our 17,000 students who live on campus. So that's a large percentage of the students. That's just our percentage living on campus of our 49,000 students. So when we look at the impacts on the macro level of our campus, you have to look at what the impact on campus culture and our campus traditions. We're the Spartans, and what does that mean to students? And our, I love Rachel's story about the Bearcats and Wildcats, and the traditions of campus sports on our college campuses, and particularly American football. And what does that mean? And last year, having this fantastic conversation with some of our international students who had made the decision on a Saturday in the fall to go off campus to get groceries, but were unable to get back on campus because they were not quite understanding about tailgating. And the path that they one time had taken through campus was no longer available to them because all our streets become one way.
Yeah.
And it was the middle of the game. And, fortunately for us, it wasn't the Michigan game. But I think that, helping students understand in this big change in the shift of what's happening across our campus about tradition and culture, and what's also happening in regards to the celebrations of culture and the holiday celebrations that are important to so large number of our students. For us, we have a large population from China, and their traditions, their holidays that are very important to them, and us recognizing those celebrations and those traditions, and what does that look and feel like for us, particularly in our on-campus housing population. The other thing is recognizing what's happening in a more global context in the world. And one of the stories of a student last year that I heard actually at the International Colloquium, a young student who was on the panel with us, was sharing a story that really opened my eyes. our international students are having such financial struggles. Our domestic students are as well. But this student was sharing that with the changes in currency during her time of enrollment, her tuition had doubled.
Wow.
And looking at that concept of what so many of our international students are going through, because there is the stereotype that some domestic students have of students from certain countries, that they all have a certain socioeconomic status, whether that be a high socioeconomic status or a low socioeconomic status, because they might know someone who drives something. But this young woman was having quite the struggle because of the currency changes, of something so out of her control. But because of currency changes, her tuition had doubled during her time of enrollment. So I think when we look at what's happening on the micro level, then we look at what's happening certainly on the smaller levels, the floor communities, what's happening in the classroom, and those types of things. When you look at someone's culinary needs, Maslow, food and shelter, having the opportunity last year, actually 2 years ago, to take 15 staff members from our institution to go to Beijing, China, to study 3 institutions in China. I know in our students, we took some resident assistants, when they got off the plane in Beijing, what's the first thing that they wanted to do? They wanted to eat. The food was not familiar to them. The first meal that they had was not familiar to them. And our international students, when they come, certainly we know the food's not familiar to them. And talking to so many of our international students, and our chefs at our institution here have done an absolutely incredible job working with our international students to make food that is familiar to them, that is comforting to them, that allows them to be academically successful. But are there institutions out there that have not made those steps? Because you may not have a mass quantity of thousands of international students to be able to do that. But if the food is making a student sick, can they be academically successful when that's happening? Are you providing break housing during the winter break? Or do students have to find somewhere to go? One of the things that our international students often arrive early. And if they're moving in to a residence hall where no one is greeting them, but they're experiencing and witnessing when the domestic students arrive, the lobbies are decorated, the resident assistants are welcoming, there's balloons available, there's a party going on, and yet it's quite the opposite when our international students move in. Why are we doing that? I believe that there should be the exact same welcoming environment when our international students arrive to our residence halls. In fact, your halls should be ready. That's opening day. International students move in. And in fact, we've made the decision here that there is no training on that day when international students move in. Our staff is available and ready for that to happen. The other thing that we've done is recognizing that a lot of the things that we have in place at our American institutions are unfamiliar to a lot of our international students. And that could be something that we take so for granted as the bathroom, as the kitchen, as a lot of the things that we simply take for granted. How are you helping international students learn how to use the bathrooms at your institution? Learn how to use the kitchens at your institution? And are we going so far? Because that's going to be an uncomfortable question for a lot of people to ask about. One of the things that some institutions are doing is creating YouTube videos. Here's how to use a kitchen. Here's how to use the bathroom. And that might be something a little more comfortable for people to go online and watch a video on their own time in the comfort of their room. Another thing is making sure that your resident assistants are, when they're taking the tours with their international students, smaller groups, international students by themselves with your hall staff, making sure that they're showing everyone, here's how the bathroom works, here's how the kitchen works, here's how the stove works, meeting those student needs. And of course there's the academic support. Are we meeting the needs of the international students in their academic support? Because we know that there's a lot of concerns out there academically. How are we helping students that have come a long way, a very long way, with a high financial investment? Are we helping students, be successful in that way? One of the situations we were working with, particularly with back to the resident assistants and housing, some of the students from China told us that they were not answering the door when the RAs were knocking, come to the floor meeting, come to the floor meeting, because they were concerned that who was knocking on their door. That was something that in their country they were not familiar with. So we have really worked with our resident assistants about how to approach that door so that it's a more safe approach to the door versus, you know, our RAs sometimes can be so excited, which we loved beginning of the year, banging on the door, come to the floor meeting, come to the floor meeting. That's not the best way to approach particularly the door of some of our international students. So I think when we look at the macro level, what's going to happen on Saturday of a tailgate, and your campus is going to be taken over, and campus traditions, down to the very specific situation of RAs banging on someone's door. We need to look at the totality of our campus experience to help our students be successful.
That's great. That's actually a great transition to my next question, which has to do with developing globally competent domestic students. And you know, when you talked about the RAs, I think that there's a huge training element there.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about, Kathy, first, about how you help students develop those skills and competencies, and then contributing to that broader global perspective on campus? Because certainly faculty and staff, teaching assistants, I mean, it spans the gamut, right, of anybody who's going to be in contact with a student.
Yeah, I think there's so much that we can do, and so much that so many institutions, so many of you out there are trying already to work on every one of us developing our global competencies. And I know even from, you know, myself and all of us, there's so much more to continue to learn as our world continues to get smaller and smaller almost each day. But working with our students, you know, here we may be working with a student who's never left the state of Michigan. In fact, was talking to someone the other day who had only been in Detroit, had never been to different parts of even in the state. And how were we going to help them, because they had actually been assigned a roommate from another country, and they were quite concerned about that. And how were we going to help them be successful in that transition to the institution this year, their freshman year? But I think there's multiple ways that we can go about helping students in developing those global competencies, and some of it is dialogue. Are we sitting down and having that dialogue, and are we training our staff in how to encourage that dialogue? There are institutions out there that have the diversity dialogue programs. There are institutions out there that have opportunities for language partners. That can be a great opportunity for persons to do that. There are themed communities, living learning communities that are focused on, you know, language development. There are opportunities out there because there are commonalities right now for scholarship that cuts across our world and the problems our world is facing, whether that be energy, our energy crisis, whether that be, you know, the global economy and things that we're facing across the world. Are there topics that are going to bring students together to have a conversation? You know, one of the things that brought our students together this summer was the World Cup.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, how do we bring people together to have common conversations, to start building relationships? We make sure that in our staff training, and that's staff training for custodial, maintenance, our resident assistants, all of our staff, that when we're talking about our intercultural training and our diversity training, that we're certainly focused on all of our community, all of the global community that's at Michigan State University, and that's a part of all of our dialogue. So we work that into all of our, you know, for my resident assistant colleagues out there, our behind closed doors scenarios, our everything that we're working on. We make sure that there's international scenarios and things that we're working on. It's an international homesick. It's some cultural situations the students are going to go through, because we want our RAs to be prepared for that situation. We also strongly encourage study abroad.
Yeah.
I cannot encourage that enough. Study abroad, whether that be study abroad for spring break, study abroad over winter break, study abroad for a semester. How can we continue to encourage, I think, study abroad? That we know is one of the best opportunities for people to really be immersed in another culture. And how do we continue to, I think, encourage people to do that? So I'd be curious what any of my colleagues have to share in terms of their ideas.
Yeah, Rachel, Bob, what are your thoughts?
Well, from my perspective, I think Arizona definitely has an interesting history as it comes to relationships with other individuals from outside the United States, and we have, like Michigan, a state where students have never left Arizona, and so it is about exposing students, kind of across the board. I think it's also encouraging students to be actively inclusive of the students who have come from other countries. If you're going to the football game, invite the folks to come with you to the football game or whatever it is, especially when you say football and they think football as opposed to football, as we think of it. But it's also, too, I think one of the things that I have done as I've taken on this role as in international admissions is be an ambassador to my colleagues on campus. I know there's only so many student lives I can directly impact and I directly touch based on the work that I do, but I know that in using the rest of my campus community, I have the ability to affect change in a broader level when it comes to working with international students. And I think one of our mantras is our international students are Wildcats. They are U of A students. They're a part of our community. Yes, we need to be conscious of who they are, where they live, how they sit, kind of what that piece in the environment looks like. But we need to make sure that their experience at the institution is the experience of the institution. And so it's really important to me to go and talk to the academic advisors, to talk to our colleagues who work in student development, residence life, activities, making sure that those little aha moments that we have when it comes to engaging with those students can be then translated to student staff and to other students through the programs and development that we do. And so it's really about balancing the lens of both encouraging participation and encouraging actively seeking out relationships and involving themselves with people from outside of the United States, and the experiences of going abroad, even, like you're saying, the study abroad, but even just traveling outside the United States. Going through the process of getting a passport in and of itself might be an eye-opening experience, and what that means for students. So I just think it's really important we continually encourage interaction.
I think what I'd add to that is I believe that there is a tension between what students are expecting from the post-secondary experience and what post-secondary administrators think is the experience that we are set up to provide and what we think is important. And I'm not saying anything that's news to anyone who works in a college or university today. Incoming domestic students have often a very particular idea of the experiences that they're looking to have, and faculty and administrators have an idea of the experience that they ought to have, should have, need to have in order to take full advantage of what the campus has to offer, and those are not always in alignment. And I would say the same thing is true for international students as well, that they may have very specific set of goals and objectives that's having them come here for a degree at a U.S. college or university, and that may not include questions about whether there's a climbing wall in the gym. I mean, to pick on an old trope, but the international students that I interviewed in my dissertation research were we would say they were remarkably pragmatic in terms of the experience that they're looking to have, that they are really looking for primarily an academic experience. So I think it's up to us as administrators to make the case to all of these student audiences why what we think about the international experience, about the value of cross-cultural learning, and to make that accessible and to make it inevitable that they're going to run into those opportunities when they're here.
Absolutely.
Great. So as I mentioned earlier, I crowdsourced several questions from Twitter, and there was a fabulous question I think that relates to this from Rachel Luna, which was about how we can have social justice conversations with an intercultural lens with both our international and with our domestic students, and I think that really relates to this broader concept about the campus culture, and then also about contributing to broader perspectives on campus. But I don't know if any of the three of you have engaged in social justice related conversations across the spectrum of student populations. You'd like to share a little bit about that experience?
Well, I think from my perspective, we do have this conversation kind of continuously. We hire international students and domestic students in our office, so there's kind of a micro lens for that. But one of the things that we kind of continually do is making sure we're contextualizing and meeting students where they are. And I think we do that in social justice education across the board, but really specifically when working with international students, understanding that sometimes where our kind of US-based lens around social justice comes from is the US-based lens, which means there is this element of our history, our socio and political culture that is embedded in those conversations. And so recognizing that moving that conversation to a global audience is more than just about having that conversation with a global audience. It's about trying to figure out and find what are the examples when you're talking to an Indian student, or when you're talking to a student from the UK, or you're talking to a student who is Algerian by birth but a French citizen and then came from a Canadian high school. I mean, you have these people who have extremely global experiences, and so you have to find the places where those conversations are most comfortable for everyone to start with. And that can really and simply and truly be the difference between what's served in the cafeteria for, and kind of contextualizing around this very highly cultural difference of the traditions of your institution versus the traditions of where they came from. The American classroom. We have one of our colleges on campus which does part of their orientation program in Mandarin. They have a large number of Chinese nationals who choose that program. And it's interesting, when they do their college classroom piece, they're going along in Mandarin, and the plagiarism comes up in English because the concepts around some of these things. But this is a moment they use the American classroom to start that journey down the social justice lens and kind of a social justice conversations.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good example, and I think it's creating space. And are we creating space for those conversations to take place? And are we working with our staff to be facilitators so that they're not, through our American lens and through our American examples, actually shutting down those conversations?
Yes.
And I think we really have to work on that sometimes, because we have it's intent and impact. How are we working to have those conversations? Because one of the things we can look at is, again, like Rachel said so well, we look at things through our lens, but sometimes our lens is actually the thing that's going to shut down that conversation. It's happening between those two students that are from two completely different parts of the world. And, my view from upstate New York just shut that whole conversation down. So we have to look at this, I think, so realistically, and what we have to learn every day from our international students, every day. And how do we help all of our staff across the institution embrace those opportunities? And there's also opportunities when you look at our colleagues in the community, the local communities in which our institutions live. And there's great opportunities for that as well.
I am mindful of an international student from Pakistan that I had the chance to work with several years ago, who moved to New York City when he was in adolescence and attended high school in New York City. And he talked to me about how he would go to this high school every day in a suit. And when called on by the teacher, he would stand to provide his answer. And as he explained to me, this opened him up to extraordinary amounts of ridicule from peers that he was otherwise trying to find a path through. But as he said, this is what we do in Pakistan. We show respect to the teacher by dressing a certain way and by answering with this kind of, in a way that I think we would probably describe as formal, and what they might describe as expected. Minimum expectation. And I think it's an example that I've held on to, because I think it really illustrates the tension that students from any background that puts them sort of on the margins of a campus community might experience when they come in. And we can think of any number of examples of groups where individual members come to campus, and that's one of the things that they have to navigate when they get here. And I think we can help by, just like Kathy says, giving students space to help work through some of these issues, some of these tensions, and where possible, introducing some language and some terminology that students can use to help describe the tension that they're feeling, and modeling respect, that our objective here isn't to stamp out graduates that all have exactly the same worldview. It's very likely that this student is going to continue on thinking that this is what's expected in a classroom environment, and I don't know that it's our job to change that.
Yeah, I think that really relates. Chris Stone Sawalish, another person from Twitter, asked the question, how do we help international students effectively navigate policy, procedure, and administration on campus? Particularly given that some cultures negotiate as a part of that given practice and standard practice. Kathy, can you talk a little bit about how this perspective relates to your work in housing?
Certainly. I think, communicate, 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 and over-communicate.
Yes.
You know, I think early on in many of our careers in student affairs, especially those of us who started out as resident assistants, you learn about the broken record approach.
Yeah.
It's the broken record approach all over again, and we never lose sight of that.
Mm-hmm.
It's helping from the very beginning about policies, procedures, in the community in which people live. This can come up in regards to it could be as simple as the Residence Life Handbook. It's about the academic expectations of the institution. And are you having those ongoing conversations, not just once, but multiple times? Because we all know what it's like and can remember our entry into the institution. It's like trying to get a drink of water from a fire hydrant.
Mm-hmm.
If you can imagine what it's like for a person that this is not your language, this is not your food, you are so far away from home and your family and your support, it's got to feel like multiple fire hoses that are pointed at you at the same time, and you have nowhere to go to be successful. And then at the same time, everyone's coming at you like, let me help, let me help, let me help. It's probably the most isolating experience for so many people. So how do we create those places where people can have those conversations? You know, we've done some simple things here in regards to having a translation service available. Is that translation service available? And it's not only available across the university, but it's also available here in our city that our university is located in. So it's available for the city police, it's available for the court system here, it's available in the local hospital. You know, are you setting up those support services and those resources that are available that you may not have the resource to have a translator and multiple languages that are on your campus that might be needed, but you do have opportunities through translation services, a third-party vendor that could be available to you. So policies and procedures, because they're going to mean different things in different cultures, and helping people understand what that means. And it could be something as simple as your alcohol policy. It could be something as extreme as your weapons policy.
Yeah.
Having dealt with all of those. So making sure you're having those conversations up front versus later on, and also understanding the impact. So if you have something as egregious enough as having to, for example, remove someone from your residence hall, if you're removing a student who's from your home state that your institution's in, that's a different experience than you just removed a student from a different country. Now, you still had the right to remove that student because of your thinking about the community and the risk to the community. But also that student is still a student in your institution, and how are you providing support to that student? So it's working through all of those things through a different lens. I think that's the most important thing, is counting to 5, stepping back, and looking through that different lens. And that's where our colleagues, and here it's International Students and Scholars, some students, you know, different offices you're going to partner with. It's having those important partnerships on your college campuses through the staff and admissions that works through the opportunity to bring our students to campus, working with study abroad office, working with your student services for international students. Those partnerships are some of the most important partnerships you can have on campus. And building those partnerships, meeting with those staff, you know, as regularly as you can, constant, you know, communication. Are you communicating with those offices? Because those are really important partnerships to have.
Definitely. And I think that international education professionals, and we had this tweeted out over their listserv today, so hopefully we have some folks watching, and we would definitely invite their questions or comments on the Twitter hashtag #HigherEdLive. But I definitely agree. I think the partnerships between student affairs and our international education professionals, whatever that office is called on your campus, is really critical. You know, Bob, do you have any examples from your work in ACPA where you for sure engage with a lot of folks who do that work? What's working on college campuses in creating strong partnerships?
Well, I think that Kathy's provided several really great examples of what that could look like on a particular campus. I think when I hear from colleagues in ACPA now, oftentimes what I'm hearing is just how dramatically the environment is shifting. And I think particularly on campuses that have reached kind of a tipping point in terms of the cohesiveness, the emergence of a really large population of students from one particular sending country, oftentimes can develop its own center of gravity. And so you can see these students sort of developing ad hoc services on their own, whether it's providing rides to the closest big city to get to an airport or to pick a friend up, or it's I've certainly heard examples from colleagues of international students who, as Kathy has said, were sort of unsure of how a washer and dryer worked, and rather than going down the hall to an RA, they went to a chat room that's for students from that country at that school to ask that question. Now, on the one hand, this is a kind of leadership in the face. These students are demonstrating resiliency and they're creating their own networks. We want students to create networks. I think when these networks are created entirely in isolation from the campus support services that are otherwise there to assist them, I think that's when we need to be aware that that's happening and to find ways that are meaningful to these students to provide access to people and to services that are there to help them.
That's great. Rachel, I know you see them when they first arrive or even pre-arrival, and I'm sure there's kind of a continuity of service that flows through your office to other offices on campus. How have you seen partnerships develop?
Well, I think for us, and the one thing I always have been, well, at least in my campus I throw out there, is that we are all international service professionals now. Well, at least here at the U of A, we've reached that tipping point. We're the type of institution where we have large numbers of international students at the undergrad and grad level, and it's important for us all to recognize that, like any other student, they walk in your office, they need service and they need support. So we do need to kind of keep that somewhere in the back of our minds. But I think for us, it's really about making sure that the places, the environments, and the people are all set up to be ready to receive these individuals. And so our International Student Services Office has been so overwhelmed with the increase that they're primarily issuing visa documents. And that's really where they've gotten to. And they have some opportunity to do student groups and that stuff, but their campus outreach isn't there. So I've taken that responsibility of making sure I'm meeting with the academic advisors. Housing has been one of our big things. We have a hall on campus that is extremely appealing to Muslim women, because we have it's a women's-only hall with women's-only spaces, which is different than a hall that maybe has a women's-only hall, but then the room a man could stay overnight or a male could stay overnight. And that can be very different, where we have what's called sleeping porches. So there is a space that truly is at that moment women's only, because there's a space that if you have a male visitor, they stay outside of that space. And for a Muslim woman, that can be a huge difference between choosing or not choosing an institution, and then needing to make sure that housing is thinking that through. Why are they choosing it? Looking at why that hall has become a popular option for international students. And although that's a small hall, maybe worthwhile keeping online 12 months out of the year for those individuals. And so it really is about contextualizing and placing focus and in the context of the work that everyone else is doing, regardless of that, if you're officially housed in an international side or you're officially in student affairs. I think there's going to be a lot more crossover. I think as our institutions grow and change, global initiatives, if that's what it's called on your campus, and student affairs will be working more closely together because we have to. We don't. There isn't really a choice in that matter.
I want to get to another Twitter question. Joe Sabato asked the question about addressing mental health issues specifically.
Yes.
And I thought that was a really critical piece that we could probably build a whole show around in terms of mental health issues on campus broadly, but specifically looking at our international student populations and keeping in mind cultural differences. Kathy, do you have some thoughts on that and what's worked in housing at MSU?
Certainly. I think, again, we keep talking about partnerships, and we can't say that enough. It's about the partnerships, and it's our staff across your university coming together in dialogue and having communication to help your students be successful, regardless of where the students are from. And I love Rachel's terminology about, they're all Wildcats, they're all Spartans, they're all, fill in the name of your, of your institution. And are you having those dialogues? So it's your institution having those conversations when a student is in distress. Are people having that dialogue about everything about that student that we know we can bring to the table and have that conversation about as campus professionals, whether that be, if it's risen to whatever level of threat, it could be your behavior intervention team, your behavior threat assessment team, your CARES team. Is it just an in-hall situation that the group is dealing with? Maybe it's an off-campus student, a member of your Greek community. It could be different members of students. Are you having those conversations that you're getting the full picture of what that student is certainly experiencing, whether that's in the classroom, in the housing, in their campus clubs and organizations? And if it's an international student, making sure that someone from International Student Services is in as a member of that conversation, because understanding and getting someone involved in that communication of the cultural context is very, very, very important. And also partnering with faculty. Many of us come from college campuses where there may be someone on your college campuses that studies that culture, that is an expert in that language, that bringing those people involved. You have subject matter experts, and it's great to bring those people in. You do not need to talk about that student in that space if you're worried about violating FERPA and all those things that are so important that we do pay attention to, but you could bring an expert in on that culture from your campus, from another campus that's nearby, and then they could exit the room. You could hang up on the conference call, and then you could get back to talking about that. Now, some of our larger institutions that have different resources, I know here at Michigan State University, we have members on our counseling staff that speak multiple languages. And that is very, very important, that the student who has chosen to go to counseling, and I know that that means so many different things in different cultures. The student who has, self-selected to go to counseling, that they are able to speak in that session in their own language. That they can have that experience, and that's something that's been very intentional. And when we search for those positions, we put language-specific requirements oftentimes in those search positions. So we have done that in the counseling center. We also make sure that when we're looking at students, from different cultures, we're also having conversations with our staff about that. We do in hall about that. So for those of you in housing, are you having those conversations about that? About what does that mean in the different cultures? And the stigmas around mental health in different cultures. And that is a very, very important conversation to have, particularly, I think, with all of your staff, but that's a great professional development session for your mid-managers, for your community directors, your hall directors, for other staff on your campus. That's an incredible professional development opportunity, and there's staff available, across the country who would probably love to lead that conversation. But having that context about what does it mean, the mental health emergencies in different college campuses, I think that I really encourage you to have sooner rather than later as the semester gets ready to start.
Definitely. That could be, as I said, a great topic for Higher Ed Live coming up. Bob, I want to shift gears for just a second because I know your doctoral research is really interesting. We have you on the call today talking specifically about international students who have used an education agent to assist with the post-secondary search process. And so I'm really curious about your study and your findings, and maybe we can all look to read that as a published paper somewhere or at some point. So why don't you share a little bit about that, and then I have one final question before I wrap up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, as I said, I study the experience that international students have with education agents. The use of agents is pretty ubiquitous these days in international recruitment, but we don't know very much about what impact they have on student choice making through the search process. I think many people at colleges and universities in the U.S. may not have heard of agents and may not even know if their campus uses agents to assist with recruitment. So a good takeaway for folks on the call would be to find out if your school uses agents. They function as a partially helpful analogy is that they're almost like private guidance counselors that students and families may hire to help them navigate the selection process. But agents can also sometimes work on commission for institutions here and elsewhere that are trying to recruit students. So in any given transaction, an agent might be getting paid both by the student and by the institution. And so often what emerges from there are some potential conflicts of interest at least. Probably one of the most salient thing we found from the research is that oftentimes when a student hires an agent, it inevitably involves really handing over oversight and management of the process to the agent. So the agent will often become the point of contact between the student and the institution. The agent may require the student to basically have all institutional email come directly to the agent and bypass the student.
Wow.
Certainly many of us that work with international students know concerns about forged test scores and personal statements and that kind of thing. It's certainly fair to say that agents frame student expectations as to what they're going to find when they come to campus, and that's why I think everyone working in higher education should be curious at least about how it is that agents are presenting their schools to prospective students.
Most definitely, and I think one of the other questions from Twitter that came up was from Sophia Sieverth, I think is how you say your last name, about safeguarding international students from scams and frauds, and that's not just at that level, but across all kinds of other things. I mean, we all get the email, that we've won $10 million, right? So, how do we help all people on our campus, but specifically international students, protect themselves from these types of risks?
Well, I think that my colleagues have said holds true in this area, in that we really need robust lines of communication open with international students so that they feel safe and comfortable telling us about what they're experiencing, because the fact is we don't really know. I've talked to people that are U.S. born but have a surname that would leave someone as perhaps assuming that they were Chinese, and they would get phone calls from people calling them wanting to speak in Chinese. Someone's gone through a phone directory and just sort of calling numbers. So we can't know what experience these students will have as they go through both campus and community. So we need to hear from them about what risks they're encountering and what kind of attention they're getting.
Yeah.
Great. So, final thoughts. This has been an absolutely fabulous conversation today, and I appreciate all three of you being on the call. There's so many other questions that we didn't get to that I appreciate my friends and colleagues from across the country contributing via Twitter. Rachel, do you want to start off kind of the final thoughts on serving international students welcome to the campus?
Sure. So wrap up a huge topic in a little bit of time. I really think that for me and for everybody who's hopefully on the call and interested in this topic is be the advocate you think the students need. And making sure that you're figuring out what you're doing in the context of your work environment, regardless of that in specifically an international discipline or if in an area where you're working with those students, about what it means for those services to be provided to those students. So it is really critical that we continually contextualize, inform, and really make sure these students feel at home at the place that they've chosen to be home for the next 4 to really 8 to 10 years, depending if they stay all the way through the pipeline, which many of them do.
For sure. Bob, final thoughts?
I love Rachel's thing that all of her that they're all wildcats. I think at once we need to commit to these students that these are all of our students, and we need to bring the same curiosity that we have brought to bringing other communities of students from the margin to the center. In a way, this is no different. We need to use our tools, we need to use our experience, we need to ask good questions, and we need to listen.
Great. Kathy?
I think this is an ongoing conversation. It does not end now. It needs to continue, and I encourage us as professionals. I was sharing yesterday as we were all getting ready for today that I was surprised last year at our national conferences there was not a lot of programs on working with international students and working with our international populations. I strongly encourage those of you on today, those of you who have colleagues across your campus, partnering, coming to ACPA, coming to NASPA, coming to ACUHO-I, getting to NACA and all of our professional associations out there and all the acronyms I just didn't list.
Yeah.
But we need to have this conversation. This is an important conversation for all of our professions in higher education to be having and continue to have. And sometimes it's the little things. Oftentimes we shoot for the big, but sometimes it's the little. One of the things we've been doing here at MSU is changing our restroom signs into 5 languages. because I was pretty happy when I was in Beijing that it said bathroom in English. Sometimes it's so I encourage all of us to not only continue to look at this theoretically and to look at this to student development theory lens and all the things that we love to do, but also let's not forget sometimes just the simple stuff, the food, the shelter, how they're going to be academically successful, how we're going to help them to move in first day of class. But I really appreciate everyone who took the time to participate today, and please keep the conversation going.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Again, I appreciate all three of you being on today's call, and thanks always to our program sponsors. And just a couple of wrap-up comments today. We are looking for a new host for Student Affairs Live. We have a person. It will be announced shortly. But meanwhile, until that person starts, I will be back 2 weeks from today, talking actually with current and incoming master's students. Thanks to Bob for the topical suggestion. Who are currently in Student Affairs Master's Prep programs about their pathways to the profession and their expectations as the next generation of Student Affairs professionals. So I really look forward to that conversation. I think it'll be really beneficial for supervisors of that population as well as for everyone who works in Student Affairs. So once again, you can receive reminders about this upcoming show and other shows by subscribing to our Higher Ed Live newsletter, or just browse our archives at Higher Ed Live. And subscribe to our iTunes podcast. So I'm Heather Shea Gasser. This is Student Affairs Live. I hope you all have a fabulous rest of your Wednesday, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. Make it a great week.